I took my wife to that party as if it were the culmination of our relationship. It was one of those nights where Los Angeles shined in a special way, reflected in the windows of designer stores and the luxurious cars that slowly passed by. The city was a perfect stage to showcase what we both, until then, appeared to be, the perfect couple. She looked stunning. The kind of woman that made anyone turn their head as we walked by. I felt proud. The kind of pride that blinds us, that makes us believe we have everything under control, when, in fact, we are on the edge of an abyss. We were greeted with smiles and formal greetings, as always. It was a party for a few, where Los Angeles's darkest secrets were masked by impeccable smiles and glasses of champagne. Everything seemed in its place. Until I needed to go to the bathroom. I took just the right amount of time to wash my face, take a deep breath and mentally go over what would be the perfect night. When I returned, she was no longer in the salon. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to hide it. After all, she was my wife. Why should I worry? Soft music filled the room as I wandered among the guests, seeking their presence. Then, like a snap, I saw him. A man, with his back turned, with a confident posture and an aura of power that dominated the space around him. By your side, she. My heart stopped for a second, but I forced my feet forward. Each step became heavier, as if the ground beneath me was giving way. They were close, very close. The kind of closeness reserved for intimacy, not casual conversations between acquaintances. My stomach dropped, and before I could think, I heard a low, familiar laugh leave her lips. He said something I couldn't catch, but her response was clear enough to destroy me inside. I missed you. Those words. The way she looked at him, as if I had never existed. There were no more doubts. The ground seemed to disappear beneath my feet, and I felt like I was falling into a dark, bottomless hole. That was the confirmation I never wanted to have, but now it was there, before my eyes. I swallowed hard. I knew I shouldn't make a scene, not there, not then. But I also couldn't just pretend that none of that was happening. A sharp pain took over me, a mixture of anger, sadness and helplessness. Betrayal, which had always seemed like a distant possibility, was now a devastating reality. As I tried to process what was happening, a question kept ringing in my mind: who was this man? Something about him seemed familiar, but I couldn't put my finger on it. Los Angeles is a city of important faces and names, and it suddenly dawned on me that he wasn't just anyone. There was a shadow of danger in his gaze, a coldness that I couldn't ignore. Every second I watched them seemed to stretch into an eternity. They were in a universe of their own, where I was just a silent spectator of a plot that unfolded without my consent. And then, before I could control myself, I stepped forward, ready to confront them. But something stopped me. It wasn't the fear of a fight or public embarrassment. It was the sudden realization that this man had more power over my life than I imagined. He wasn't just a casual lover. He was someone with influence, someone who could change everything. The way he touched her, the way he possessed her with his gaze, was proof that this was not something recent. They had been involved for a long time, perhaps longer than I could imagine. And now, I found myself trapped in a web of lies, manipulation, and dark secrets. I wanted to explode. I wanted to scream, to break that unbearable silence that suffocated me. But I knew the truth was far more dangerous than I could bear. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was something bigger, something that threatened not just my marriage, but my life as a whole. The question that never left my mind as I watched them was, why would she take so much risk? Why get involved with someone so dangerous? What I was about to discover that night went far beyond simple marital betrayal. Richard watched his wife, Emily, as she prepared for that night's party. There was something mesmerizing about her delicate gestures. Every movement, from the way she tied her hair to the soft touch of lipstick on her lips, was like a rehearsed choreography, perfectly executed. He remembered the first day he saw her, so many years ago, and the feeling of enchantment was still there. Emily was a woman who never went unnoticed, always with an aura of elegance that made everyone around her turn to look at her, even if just for a brief second. And that night, she looked especially stunning. She smiled at Richard in the bedroom mirror as she adjusted her necklace. He silently approached her and observed her closely, but there was something different. It wasn't that she had suddenly changed, but rather the way he saw her. Lately, Richard felt a certain distance between the two, a rift that seemed to grow every day, but he couldn't pinpoint exactly what caused it. Maybe it was the time, maybe it was the tiredness of the routine, or even the constant pressure of keeping up appearances in a society that values success and perfection so much. "You look beautiful," he commented, trying to shake those thoughts away. Emily slowly turned around and smiled. "Thank you," she replied, with a sparkle in her eyes that he no longer knew how to interpret. For years, their marriage was what many would call exemplary. They had a comfortable life, a beautiful house, and shared moments that, in everyone's eyes, were full of happiness. But Richard knew that behind closed doors, their marriage wasn't always as perfect as it seemed. External pressure, the need to always live up to social expectations, was beginning to take its toll. Richard was a successful businessman, and that meant maintaining an image. Emily, in turn, had always played the role of ideal wife, accompanying him to events and keeping his home life in order. However, something had changed between them in the last few months, and although he had tried to ignore it, he could no longer pretend that everything was okay. "Ready for the party?" she asked, as she grabbed her bag. Richard nodded, even though part of him wanted to say no. He hated these parties full of falsehood, but he knew it was necessary to be present. People from his professional circle would be there, and maintaining those connections was crucial to his business. Emily knew this too, and they followed the choreography together, as always. As they walked down the stairs and got into the car, the silence between the two seemed heavier than ever. Richard tried to concentrate on driving, but every now and then he glanced sideways at Emily, who was watching the landscape through the window in the distance. He wondered if she also felt the same emptiness he had been feeling. Or if, somehow, this was all just a passing phase. Maybe he was the one reading too much between the lines. The party took place in a luxurious mansion on the outskirts of the city, a place frequented by those at the top of society. Once there, they were greeted with fake smiles and hugs, superficial conversations and exaggerated laughter. Richard followed the greetings and introductions on automatic, while his mind was divided between small talk and the furtive glances he threw at Emily. She, as always, was the center of attention. Women admired her, men envied her. He always knew she had that effect on people, but that night, it bothered him more than usual. As they walked around the room, Richard noticed that Emily seemed especially excited, chatting with acquaintances and laughing at jokes he didn't find funny. He forced a smile as he talked to other businessmen, but his thoughts kept returning to her. An uncomfortable feeling of insecurity was beginning to take over him, a shadow of doubt that he still couldn't name. "Everything is fine?" asked one of the guests, noticing Richard's distraction. He shook his head, returning to the conversation. "Yeah, everything's great. Just thinking about business," he replied with a practiced smile, something he had learned to do years ago. It was easy to hide your true emotions behind a mask of success. But deep down, he knew there was something different about that night. Something he still couldn't understand. The clock ticked slowly, and the room continued to fill with important people, all there to strengthen their connections, just like Richard. He took a sip of champagne, but the taste was bitter in his mouth. He wanted to be able to escape, he wanted to be able to distance himself from that life that, little by little, seemed to suffocate him. However, he knew that this was not possible. Not at that moment. As Emily laughed with a group of friends, Richard felt the need to step away for a moment. "I'm going to the bathroom," he whispered in her ear, and she just nodded with a distracted smile. Walking down the luxuriously decorated hallway, he tried to push away the thoughts that were tormenting him. Maybe it was just paranoia, maybe it was the stress of work. He entered the bathroom and looked at his reflection in the mirror. What had changed? He felt like something inside him was different, as if the marriage he valued so much was slipping out of his hands. The last few months have been marked by an inexplicable distance between him and Emily. She, once so present, seemed increasingly distant. Had he done something wrong? Or was it that, deep down, he could no longer keep up with her? Washing his face, Richard tried to compose himself. He needed to be strong, he needed to keep up appearances, like he always did. But when he left the bathroom, something inside him knew that nothing would be the same again. Richard left the bathroom with his mind still filled with that uncomfortable feeling that had accompanied him since the beginning of the night. Voices and laughter echoed throughout the large hall, but, to him, everything seemed distant, as if he were watching a scene that no longer belonged to his life. He spotted Emily in the distance, talking to some people he didn't immediately recognize. She was smiling, but the smile, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed to hide something. He walked towards the bar, trying to ease the tension with another glass of champagne. The cold liquid didn't bring the relief I expected. Doubt was pounding in his head, making him uneasy. What was happening? When did he start to feel like something was wrong? The previous weeks passed in a blur, with Emily becoming more distant, more evasive in conversations, leaving home early and returning later. Excuses for dinners with friends and work commitments became frequent. Richard found himself watching her from afar. She remained the center of attention, always surrounded by smiles and looks. But the way he interacted with people seemed different. There was an air of distraction, as if his mind was somewhere else. Richard was never the jealous type, he always trusted Emily completely, but tonight brought an uneasiness that he could no longer ignore. "Are you enjoying the party?" A female voice woke him from his thoughts. A woman he barely knew pulled him into an unimportant conversation. He smiled, trying to remain friendly, but his mind was elsewhere, always returning to Emily. As the woman talked about trivialities, Richard realized that his attention was caught elsewhere in the room, and all he could think about was where Emily might be right now. Without giving much explanation, Richard walked away, his watchful gaze searching for his wife. The room was crowded, and he had to walk through the groups of guests until, finally, he saw a half-open door at the end of the large corridor, beyond the main party area. He didn't know what made him walk there, he just followed an instinct, a feeling that something was out of place. The hallway seemed quieter, away from the noise of the party. Every step he took echoed off the walls. A cold feeling crept up his spine, a feeling he couldn't explain. The heart started to speed up. He reached the door, hesitated for a second, and then heard a muffled laugh. Her laugh. The same thing that once comforted him now sounded like a dagger. His palm slowly rested on the doorknob. His breathing was heavy, but he forced himself to continue. He pushed the door open carefully, and what he saw on the other side froze him. Emily was there, with another man. A man he had already glimpsed at the party, but didn't completely recognize. They were close, closer than they should have been, their gazes intense, their gestures intimate. His hands on her body, her mouth close to his. Richard felt the ground slip away from beneath his feet. His stomach turned, and he couldn't think of anything other than the image in front of him. The world around seemed to have fallen silent. He couldn't hear anything else except the dull sound of blood coursing through his veins, and that scene, that damned scene, burning itself into his mind forever. She didn't see him. Neither does he. They were so absorbed in each other that Richard could have been there for hours and they wouldn't have noticed. Time seemed to have stopped, and the air in the hallway became heavy, almost unbearable. The betrayal, that betrayal that he had always believed was impossible, was now palpable, real, cold and devastating. Richard felt a mixture of anger and despair. He wanted to confront them right then, demand explanations, but his voice didn't come out. His legs didn't move. He felt weak, helpless, as if his entire life was crumbling before his eyes. Everything he had built, all the moments, the smiles, the promises. It all seemed like a farce. Emily had betrayed him. It wasn't just suspicion, it wasn't paranoia. It was real. She was there, in another man's arms, completely immersed, as if Richard had never existed. The pain was immense, almost physical. And the anger began to build, slowly burning inside, mixing with sadness and shock. He didn't know how long he stood there, watching, trying to process what his eyes were seeing. His head spun with 1,000 questions, but, above all, a single question echoed in his mind: why? Before he could make any move, Emily laughed again, that soft laugh, and the man whispered something that Richard couldn't hear. They slowly walked away and went out the other door, leaving Richard alone in the dark corridor, with the bitter taste of betrayal in his mouth and a storm of emotions that he didn't know how to control. Everything had changed. Richard was still dazed, lost in that sense of unreality, as if his world had been ripped from beneath his feet without warning. The image of Emily in another man's arms burned in his mind, replaying like a horrible movie he couldn't escape. But there was something else that tormented him, something he still couldn't define. Who was that man? Why had she taken so much risk? How long had this been going on? He couldn't understand, but he needed answers. Minutes passed as he stood in the empty hallway, breathing heavily. The anger that had previously paralyzed him was beginning to give way to icy determination. He couldn't just leave without confronting them. The betrayal he had witnessed had broken any barrier of understanding or empathy. He wanted an explanation. He wanted to know why his marriage, which he believed to be solid, had crumbled so cruelly. Without thinking much, Richard decided to follow them. His steps, once hesitant, were now firm, driven by pain and the need for justice. He crossed the hall, entered the same door through which Emily and the man had exited. As he crossed the small private room, his hands were clenched into fists, his knuckles white from the force he applied, trying to control the whirlwind of emotions. When he entered the next room, an elegantly decorated room away from the hustle and bustle of the party, he saw them again. Emily and the man were standing with their backs to him, in what seemed like an intense conversation. He could feel the tension in the air, but now Richard's goal was different. He didn't need to hear whispers, he needed truths. Your truths. So, is this how it's going to be? Richard's voice echoed in the room, sharp, filled with a mixture of sadness and anger. Emily froze. For a brief moment, she didn't turn around. It was as if she was processing what had just happened. The man next to her, however, immediately turned around. The look of coolness and control he gave Richard only further fueled the fury burning within him. Emily finally turned around, her face revealing surprise and, perhaps, a hint of regret. But it was too late. Everything she said now would seem empty. Richard, Emily began, but the words caught in her throat. There was a lot to explain, a lot to say, but she knew nothing could erase what he had seen. Richard took a step forward, his eyes fixed on the man next to Emily. He was tall, older than Richard, and carried an air of someone in control. Something about him awakened a strange feeling in Richard, a connection he couldn't explain. Who are you? Richard demanded, trying to maintain control of the situation even though inside he was on the verge of an emotional breakdown. The man smiled in a restrained, almost condescending way, as if he were dealing with a minor situation. Does it really matter now? He replied with a calm that made Richard's blood boil. Yes, it does, Richard said through gritted teeth, his gaze piercing the man angrily. He wanted to understand what was happening, but he felt that, with each word exchanged, he was moving further away from the answers. Emily placed her hand on Richard's arm, trying to ease the growing tension, but he pulled away. Richard, please, I can explain. He stared at her, unable to hide the pain. Explain what, Emily? That you betrayed me? That everything we experienced was a lie? The room seemed to shrink, suffocating the three with the weight of those words. Emily lowered her gaze, unable to sustain it, while the man remained impassive, observing the scene as if he were a mere spectator, waiting for his turn to enter the scene. "How long has this been going on?" Richard insisted, his voice now lower, almost a whisper, but still filled with pain. Emily hesitated, unable to respond immediately. The silence that followed was deafening. She knew there was no way to soften the impact of the truth. "Months," the word finally left Emily's lips, and Richard felt as if a final blow had been struck. Months. All that time, and he had no idea. How could he be so blind? He shook his head, taking a step back, trying to process the scope of what he was hearing. Every day of those months now felt like a lie, a farce carefully orchestrated so he wouldn't notice. But what he still couldn't understand was why. Why, Emily? Why? His voice was now almost a desperate plea, as if he still believed there was some logical explanation for all of this. She closed her eyes for a moment, as if searching for the strength to speak. I didn't want it to be like this, Richard. But, he's not who you think he is. Those words, so vague and full of mystery, awakened something in Richard. He looked at the man beside her, trying to connect the dots. Who was that man? And what did he have to do with your life? The man finally stepped forward, taking control of the conversation. His gaze was calculated, cold, as if it were all just a game. You're out of your depth here, Richard, he said in a firm, authoritative voice. There are things you don't understand. And maybe it's better that way. Richard frowned, a mixture of anger and confusion rising within him. I demand answers. Who are you, and what do you have with my wife? Emily tried to intervene, but the man raised his hand, interrupting her. My name is Alexander. And I'm more than just a lover, Richard. I am someone who has the power to change your life in the blink of an eye. Those words echoed in Richard's mind, and suddenly, everything started to make sense. Alexander was not just any man. He was a powerful figure, someone with influence and resources that went far beyond what Richard could imagine. The coldness in Alexander's eyes revealed that he was in control, not just of Emily, but of everything that happened there. Richard took a step back, trying to assimilate what he had just heard. He knew there was something wrong from the start, but now it was clear. It wasn't just a betrayal. It was something much bigger, something that went beyond their marriage. And in that moment, Richard realized that his life, his marriage, and everything he thought he knew was about to completely fall apart. Alexander remained silent for a few seconds, letting the weight of his words fall on Richard. The silence in the room was almost palpable, filled with tension and unspoken promises. Richard was on the edge of an abyss, and Alexander's cold and controlled figure was the push he needed to fall. I'm not just here for Emily, Alexander finally said, breaking the silence. I'm here because there's so much more at stake. Things you can't even begin to understand. Richard glanced at Emily, who remained silent, her face a mix of guilt and submission. That wasn't the behavior he expected from her. Emily has always been a strong, determined woman. And now, she looked completely dominated, a shadow of herself beside Alexander. Are you threatening me? Richard's voice was low, almost hoarse. He was struggling to maintain control, but panic was beginning to take over. Is this some kind of blackmail? Alexander stepped forward, his stance intimidating. I don't need to threaten you, Richard. You are already in a vulnerable position. Everything you thought you knew is about to change. Emily finally looked up, tears welling up. I didn't want you to find out like this. But Alexander, he's more than you think. I had no choice. Richard gaped. There was no choice. Like this? What did he do to you, Emily? She hesitated, the words weighing heavily in her mouth. He has control over everything. He's not just a lover, Richard. He's dangerous. Richard's blood ran cold. Everything that seemed like a simple and devastating betrayal now took on much greater proportions. Alexander wasn't just a man Emily was having an affair with. He was a real threat, something that put their lives in danger. Alexander approached, his piercing gaze fixed on Richard. Now do you understand, Richard? What happened between Emily and me is just the surface. There are things at stake that you cannot control. You were living an illusion, thinking you had control of your life, your marriage. But the truth is, from the beginning, you never had. Richard looked at Emily, searching for some kind of explanation. Richard stood there, frozen for a moment, as Alexander's words reverberated in his mind. You never had control. That statement hit him like an uncomfortable truth that, until then, he had ignored. Throughout their marriage, he deluded himself with the idea that he was the pillar of his life, of his relationship with Emily, of his business. But now, faced with Alexander and Emily's explicit betrayal, that certainty crumbled. Emily, is this true? You had no choice. Richard finally broke the silence, his voice filled with a mixture of despair and a subtle plea, as if he was still searching for some explanation that could soften the impact of the betrayal. Emily looked away, unable to bear the weight of the pain in his eyes. Guilt was written all over his face, but there was something more. Fear. She hesitated, biting her bottom lip, before finally replying, "It's not that simple, Richard. I got caught up in something much bigger than the two of us." He didn't know how to react to that. Anger and frustration began to give way to a new type of anguish. Bigger than both of us? How can you say that? He took a step forward, without taking his eyes off her, trying to decipher the layers of emotions that Emily was hiding. I am your husband. We spent years together. How can you just destroy this? Alexander, until then impassive, interrupted with a condescending sigh. Richard, you are still thinking too simplistically. This isn't about love, or even about you and Emily. This is about power. And the power was never yours. You were always just a piece in this game. Those words brought a new wave of tension. The farce of marriage was no longer the center of her suffering. Now, he was faced with something that transcended betrayal. Richard realized that his life was entwined in a dangerous game that he didn't even know existed. He looked at Emily again, trying to find some explanation in her eyes, some sign that there was still something authentic between them. But all he found was a deep sadness, a silent recognition that there was no going back. Richard, she whispered, almost apologetically. I was trapped, caught up in something I couldn't control. Alexander, he has connections, he has the power to destroy everything we've built if he wanted to. Richard blinked, trying to absorb what she was saying. Are you with him out of fear? The idea that she had cheated out of coercion was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, this partially absolved her of guilt. On the other, it meant his life was as out of his control as he feared. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me? Emily closed her eyes, fighting back the tears that were now threatening to fall. I thought I could handle it on my own. I thought somehow I could protect you, I could keep everything the way it was without you knowing. But then things got out of my control. Richard felt a crushing weight in his chest. The emotional betrayal was still there, intact, but now it came with a new layer of complexity. He was faced with a moral dilemma that he could not ignore. Emily, his wife, had betrayed him, but she was also involved in something bigger, something that could put their lives at risk. He looked at Alexander, who stood firm, as if he was savoring every second of Richard's confusion and despair. Was this what he wanted? Tear apart the man he saw as a threat or, even worse, as someone irrelevant to his game? What do you want, Alexander? Richard asked, his voice filled with a weariness he couldn't hide. What do you want from me and my wife? Alexander gave a slight smile, as if that question was exactly what he expected to hear. I already have what I want, Richard. You were always the obstacle. Now, with you out of the way, I can continue with my plans. Emily, she's part of this, whether you like it or not. Richard felt his body stiffen. Do you think you can just erase everything we've built? Take my wife away from me and continue as if I didn't exist? Alexander took a step forward, his gaze cold and penetrating. You've never been important, Richard. The issue here isn't you. It's what I can do. What I've always been able to do. And now, I'm giving you a choice: either you walk away and leave this all behind, or you sink deeper into this confusion. Alexander's words cut deep, hitting Richard like an unexpected blow. What should he do? How could he just walk away from the scene and leave Emily in the hands of a man who seemed to control everything? Thoughts raced quickly through her mind, and the pain of betrayal began to be overshadowed by a new type of anguish, the fear of the unknown, the fear that her life, her safety, and Emily's own integrity were threatened by something much greater than he could imagine. Richard closed his eyes for a moment, trying to breathe, trying to organize the chaos in his mind. He knew Alexander's answer was simple, but the implications were too complex to ignore. And now, he was at a crossroads that had no easy way out. I'm not just going to give up my life, Richard finally said, his voice firm yet filled with uncertainty. If you think you can intimidate me, you're wrong. I will find out the truth, and I will fight for what's mine. Alexander laughed softly, but said nothing. He knew Richard was still lost, still trying to find a way to fight in a game that had already been decided long ago. And now, the issue wasn't just about the destroyed marriage. It was about something much darker, much more dangerous. The silence in the room was overwhelming, as if time itself had stopped. Richard stared at Alexander, feeling the weight of the choices he would need to make. He had reached the end of the road, and the answers he sought would not bring comfort, only more pain. However, there was a final decision in front of him, something he would need to face alone, with no hope of redemption for what had happened. Emily, motionless next to Alexander, seemed a distant figure. His eyes were dull, as if all his vital energy had been drained by the choices he made. The remorse was there, written all over her face, but there was also a bitter acceptance. She knew their fate as a couple was sealed. Richard, please, Emily tried, but her voice came out weak, without conviction. She knew that nothing she said now could change what she had done, or what was to come. Richard, however, didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on Alexander. He knew that the man before him was not just a threat to his marriage, but to everything he had built throughout his life. Alexander had the power to destroy him not only emotionally, but professionally. And, worse, he knew that Emily had become a fundamental player in this game. You're right, Alexander, Richard finally said, his voice firm but carrying a resigned bitterness. I never had control, did I? And now, everything is gone. He took a deep breath, trying to maintain what little dignity he had left. But I will not disappear quietly. Alexander raised an eyebrow, curious. And what are you going to do, Richard? What cards do you still have to play? Richard was silent for a few seconds. There was a truth that Alexander ignored. The control that man thought he had was not absolute. Alexander believed that power and influence were everything, but there was something he didn't count on, the human capacity to resist, to fight, even when everything seemed lost. I'll expose you, Richard said finally. I'm going to tell the world who you really are, and what you've done. You may be powerful, but no one is untouchable. I will make sure everyone knows. Alexander laughed, a low, cynical laugh. You have no idea what you are saying. I can destroy your life before you have a chance to open your mouth. But Richard was not intimidated. For the first time that night, he felt a strength growing within him, an unshakable will to fight. Maybe you can destroy me, yes. But I have nothing left to lose. And that's your mistake, Alexander. You underestimated what a man with nothing can do. Alexander's eyes hardened, and he took a step forward, ready to end this once and for all. But at that moment, Emily stepped between the two. Enough, she screamed, her voice desperate. He arrives. I can't do this anymore. Emily's confession was like an electric shock to both men. She turned to Richard, tears streaming down her face. I was scared, Richard. I got involved with Alexander because of what he could offer me, the power he had. But deep down, I knew it would destroy everything. I knew it would destroy you. Richard, still stunned, tried to process those words. There was no more room for explanations. There were no more excuses. Emily, in a last act of desperation, turned to Alexander. I can't be part of this anymore. He finished. Alexander looked at her with a mixture of contempt and disappointment. Do you think you can just snap out of this? I gave you everything, Emily. And now you want to go back. She shook her head, her eyes teary. I have no choice. Not after everything I've done. Richard felt a strange surge of empathy for her. Despite everything, despite the betrayal and the lies, he knew that Emily was trapped too. Trapped in the consequences of her own decisions, but somehow still looking for a way out. Alexander, realizing he was losing control of the situation, took a step back. You two are pathetic. Do you think you can face me? Do you think you have some power here? He laughed again, but now there was a bitterness in his tone. It doesn't matter what they do. In the end, I will always win. Richard looked at Emily, and for a brief moment, he realized that, despite everything, they shared something deeper. It wasn't love, not anymore. But there was a mutual understanding of the tragedy their lives had become. It's over, Alexander, Richard said, his voice firm. You lost. Alexander stared at them, assessing the situation, trying to find a way to turn the tide. But something inside him seemed to give up. He knew that although he still had the power to wreak havoc, the control he valued so much was slipping through his fingers. Without another word, he turned and left the room, leaving Richard and Emily alone in the wake of his destruction. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Richard and Emily stood there, not knowing what to say, not knowing what would come next. The open wounds between them would never heal completely, but somehow, they both knew that this was the only possible way out. I'm so sorry, Emily whispered, her voice breaking. Richard looked at her, feeling a mixture of pain and exhaustion. Me too. They knew there was no going back. But at that moment, they realized that Alexander's power had lost its weight. Now it was up to them to decide how to rebuild their lives, separated, perhaps, but finally free. So, what did you think of this story? Leave your opinion in the comments. I'm curious to know what you thought of this plot full of twists. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss any of the next stories. Until next time.